welcome to We the Village, produced by Ron Hall, and I am your host, Sharonda Allen. This is my first post-COVID We the Village episode, and some of the things that are going on in American society and in the world is social distancing. I like to call it physical distancing because we are all still very social. We're just not as physically connected. But in the meantime, we know the old adage that when America has a cold, Black America has pneumonia. What has happened with this COVID-19, this coronavirus, it has exposed a lot of the inequities that are going on in American society. There are a lot of reasons why there are racial inequities and why some people have more than others or maybe disenfranchised. And, we have the problem of police brutality. We have the remnants of slavery. Post-traumatic slave syndrome is serious. We also have the effects of Jim Crow and redlining when it comes to real estate. So a lot of those things, those phenomenon have an impact on generational wealth. We have racism when it comes to hiring. And when people generationally have not been allowed to participate in particular careers or job opportunities, it diminishes their development of wealth or their growth in their economic or personal financial situation. So part of what needs to be done is that, we have, of course, the Green New Deal, which was authored by various people in the House of Representatives. It's House Resolution 109. One of our most popular Congress people, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she's one of the authors of it. We have other representatives from Illinois and New York, McCollum. We have Miss Waters, Maxine Waters. So what we need to look at is that we need to be more civically involved in every aspect of our lives. The Green New Deal talks about frontline and vulnerable communities. Those communities include indigenous people, people of color, migrant communities, de-industrialized communities, depopulated rural communities, the poor, low-income workers, women, the elderly, the unhoused, people with disabilities, and the youth. So it's a broad spectrum of individuals. And with this Green New Deal, there are a lot of improvements that are requested in this particular piece of legislation. Some have to do with the environment, they have to do with healthcare and housing and economic development. But what I want to present for this particular episode, not only do we look at this legislation that was presented in February of 2009, these individuals in Congress believe that the federal government has the duty to create this Green New Deal for all Americans to improve, for things to get better. Now, in this COVID world, post-COVID, and we're in the age of COVID right now, but after all this is over, we need to emerge better. We need agendas. We have celebrities like Sean Puffy Combs, who is saying he's going to hold the vote hostage unless Biden comes out with this idea or Trump comes out with that idea. But what are the demands? What are some of the things that his community is asking for, my community? Well, we don't have to look very far because some things do not require the reinvention of the wheel. We have the Niagara movement's Declaration of Principles from back in 1905. This organization was the predecessor of the NAACP. W.E.B. Du Bois and a lot of other prominent African Americans, such as Ida B. Wells, participated in these various movements for African American well-being. So when we talk about people of color, the majority of peoples of color during that time in 1905 happened to be African Americans, Black people. And these principles, these various bullet points were put in place to give an agenda to the United States to say, hey, these are the things you need to be doing for us. Of course, we have the Green New Deal in 2019, but we have the Niagara Movement Declaration of Principles from 1905, over 100 years before. If we had held on to this document and kept true to it, I think we'd all be doing better today. So I'm going to go over some of the points in the Declaration of Principles. We have progress. The members of the conference, known as the Niagara Movement, assembled in an annual meeting at Buffalo, July 11th, 1905. Congratulate the Negro Americans on certain undoubted evidences of progress in the last decade, particularly the increase of intelligence, the buying of property, the checking of crime, the uplift in home life, advances in literature and art, and the demonstration of constructive and executive ability and the conduct of great religious, economic, and educational institutions. So in this Declaration of Principles, they're talking about the progress that was made between 1895 and 1905. So there was a lot of progress. Various church organizations, Black businesses, Black towns, educational institutions such as HBCUs, which is historically Black colleges and universities. And we also have suffrage. At the same time, we believe that this class of American citizens should protest emphatically and continually against the curtailment of their political rights. We believe in manhood suffrage. We believe that no man is so good, intelligent, or wealthy as to be entrusted wholly with the welfare of his neighbor. So basically, you should not have a poll tax, meaning that the wealthy people can pay their way into participating into politics or civics or putting the right elected officials into office who will do the bidding of their constituents. So suffrage for women didn't come until 1920, but African American men gained the right to vote with the Moore Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And it was actually the 15th Amendment that gave suffrage to Black men. Then we have civil liberty. We believe also in protest against the curtailment of our civil rights. All American citizens have the right to equal treatment in places of public entertainment according to their behavior and deserts. Meaning, if people are behaving well, this should not be kept from going particular places. We have a lot of voter suppression. We are having currently, during the age of COVID, African Americans who are being attacked for jogging through particular neighborhoods, when police officers in cities like New York, when they are arresting or checking citizens who they say are violating the mask orders, disproportionately, people of color, African American people and Hispanic people are being arrested and accosted more than white people in a lot of major cities. And that is a major problem that I've seen myself. My daughter and I went to the park a few weeks ago, and the county police officers were very hostile toward us. And I believe that it's the age of Trump that may be creating these hostilities. Bipartisan or not, when you look at character and you look at quotes and what individuals are saying and what they're working toward and who they support, we got to understand that there's a cause and effect and there are consequences for words and behaviors. So economic opportunity. We especially complain against the denial of equal opportunities to us in economic life. In the rural districts of the South, this amounts to peonage and virtual slavery. All over the South, it tends to crush labor and small business enterprises, and everywhere American prejudice, helped often by iniquitous laws, is making it more difficult for Negro Americans to earn a decent living. So during that time, you still had a lot of sharecropping, and sharecropping created a situation of perpetual debt. Of course, denial of equal opportunity in economics was destroying Black businesses or not allowing Black business people to take out loans, and also just sabotage. A lot of sabotage went on against African Americans and American society. Education. Common school education should be free to all American children and compulsory. High school training should be adequately provided for all, and college training should be the monopoly of no class or race in any section of our common country. We believe that in defense of our own institutions, the United States should aid common school education, particularly in the South. And we especially recommend concerted agitation to this end. We urge an increase in public high school facilities in the South, where the Negro Americans are almost wholly without such provisions. We favor well-equipped trade and technical schools for the training of artisans, and the need of adequate and liberal endowment for a few institutions of higher education must be patent to sincere well-wishers of the race. What that means is that education should not just be for the rich. Every American should be allowed. Mind you, this document is from 1905. What's really sad is that as African Americans, we still suffer from a lot of these inequities, and we are still victims of a lot of the problems that have gone on in American society. And when they talk about African Americans in the South, many times as the agrarian economic situation of working in the fields was more prominent because of the longer growing seasons, many African Americans were not afforded a high school education because they had to work in the fields. Whereas in the North, there was better opportunity, but things weren't always as well off for African Americans. We have courts. Still having problems with the courts today. We demand upright judges in courts, juries selected without discrimination on account of color, and the same measure of punishment and the same efforts at reformation for Black as for white offenders. We know today in 2020 that African Americans can commit the same crime or the same offense as a white person, but we know based on data, real numbers and real facts, that white people will spend less time in jail than a Black person for committing the same crime. Many times, white Americans will only receive probation, whereas an African American will be convicted for many, many years in prison or in jail. And it says here, we need for orphanages and farm schools for dependent children, juvenile reformatories for delinquents, and the abolition of the dehumanizing convict lease system. We're not supposed to have an official convict lease system, but we do with many major prisons who farm out their inmates to companies to do work, and they make pennies. Public opinion. We note with alarm the evidence of retrogression in this and of the land of sound public opinion on the subject of manhood rights, Republican government, and human brotherhood. And we pray, God, that this nation will not degenerate into a mob of boasters and oppressors. And we have, folks, but rather will return to the faith of the fathers, that all men were created free and equal with certain unalienable rights. So degenerates not become degenerates, mobs of boasters and oppressors. That could go for people of other races, and that could also go for African American people who are living in conditions where you have people who have factions that are able to discriminate against other Black people because of their affiliations. That is not a good thing that is going on in America. Health. We plead for health, for an opportunity to live in decent houses and localities, for a chance to rear our children in physical and moral cleanliness. In the age of COVID, we know that many schools were not cleaned well enough. We know that many communities and streets were not cleaned well enough. We know that many people were not washing their hands the way they should have. So that has pushed and increased the spread of the coronavirus. And the proof is in the fact that there have been public service messages and announcements stating that people need to wash their hands, because they haven't been doing that as well as they should have been. Employers and labor unions. We hold up for public execration the conduct of two opposite classes of men. The practice among employers of importing ignorant Negro American laborers in emergencies and then affording them neither protection nor permanent employment, and the practice of labor unions and proscribing and boycotting and oppressing thousands of their fellow toilers simply because they are Black. These methods have accentuated and will accentuate the war of labor and capital, and they are disgraceful to both sides. Well, in this passage, what they're talking about is the historical racist nature of labor unions. Labor unions were created for white workers to come together and to agree upon the terms of their labor, to demand living wages, to demand certain benefits and certain conditions, certain working hours. And at that time, they would not allow Black men to enter into labor unions, their labor unions. We also had the Pullman Porter labor union. Those were the Black men who worked on the American railway systems. So we also need to continue to be able, as Americans, to unionize, to demand fair and equitable treatment in labor situations. Protest is the next one. We refuse to allow the impression to remain that the Negro American assents to inferiority, is submissive under oppression, and apologetic before insults. Through helplessness, we may submit, but the voice of protest of 10 million Americans must never cease to assail the ears of their fellows so long as America is unjust. So what they're saying here is that we need to protest all the time, continuously, about the fact that Black Americans have been treated inferiorly. This document back from 1905 and the lack of gaining a lot of these rights have continued to put us in the positions that we are in today as African Americans. Color line. This is a major topic that W.E.B. Du Bois dealt with many times in his speaking. Color line. Any discrimination based simply on race or color is barbarous. We care not how hallowed it be by custom, expediency, or prejudice. That means, well, it's always been that way. No, we don't care. It needs to change. Differences made on account of ignorance, immorality, or disease are legitimate methods of fighting evil. And against them, we have no word of protest, but discriminations based simply and solely on physical peculiarities, place of birth, color of skin, are relics of that unreasoning human savagery of which the world is and ought to be thoroughly ashamed. So back in 1905, African Americans were demanding to get rid of color prejudice, ensure that racism and discrimination based on the color of your skin or your origin needs to go away, that it needs to end. And we still have it over 100 years later. Jim Crow cars. We protest against the Jim Crow car since its effects is and must be to make us pay first-class fare for third-class accommodations, render us open to insults and discomfort, and to crucify wantonly our womanhood and self-respect. Women are women, and if you're a woman of any race, you should demand that all women are treated well and respected. Soldiers. We regret that this nation has never seen fit adequately to reward the Black soldier who in its 5 wars, at that time there were 5 wars that African Americans in America was involved in. And so Black men have defended their country with their blood and yet have been systematically denied the promotions which their abilities deserve. And we regard as unjust the exclusion of Black boys from the military and naval training schools. So what has happened in wars, every single war in the United States, African American soldiers were the ones bringing home the victory. the Tuskegee Airmen, the 54th of Massachusetts, the Harlem Hellfighters. Look it up. It's real. War amendments. Those were those amendments I talked about. We urge upon Congress the enactment of appropriate legislation for securing the proper enforcement of those articles of freedom, the 13th Amendment that gave African Americans emancipation from slavery, freedom from slavery. The 14th Amendment, which granted African Americans citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which granted suffrage or the right to vote for Black men. These amendments of the Constitution of the United States. What they wanted was that people would be able to have those rights and that the law would be enforced, and that domestic terroristic racist white mobs would not be allowed to block African Americans from capitalizing off of their rights under the U.S. Constitution. Oppression. We repudiate the monstrous doctrine that the oppressor should be the sole authority as to the rights of the oppressed. The Negro race in America stolen, ravaged, and degraded, struggling up through difficulties and oppression, needs sympathy and receives criticism, needs help and is given hindrance, needs protection and is given mob violence, needs justice and is given charity, needs leadership and is given cowardice and apology, needs bread and is given a stone. This nation will never stand justified before God until these things are changed. You can't demonize a people if you are helping to create trauma, or you are supporting traumatic situations or standing by during traumatic situations. The church. Especially are we surprised and astonished at the recent attitude of the Church of Christ, of an increase of a desire to bow to racial prejudice, to narrow the bounds of human brotherhood, and to segregate Black men to outer sanctuary. This is wrong, unchristian, and disgraceful to the 20th century civilization. What that means is that as Christians, Black people were not even allowed to sit in the same sanctuary as white people. And if we are all God's children and you're supposed to subscribe to Christianity, that is against the doctrine of what's going on in the Bible. So this talks about even in spiritual life, we have to make changes in our churches. The church, any church, should not allow it. Agitation. It's the next one. Of the above grievance, we do not hesitate to complain, and to complain loudly and insistently. To ignore, overlook, or apologize for these wrongs is to prove ourselves unworthy of freedom. Persistent manly agitation is the way to liberty. And toward this goal, the Niagara movement has started and asked the cooperation of all men of all races. That is something that we need to look at today. Every race needs to be concerned about the oppression of any race, because with the COVID virus, that the coronavirus is going around, we actually have a lot of discrimination against Chinese Americans. And there are a lot of other ethnic groups who are protesting the discrimination and the racism. And even from the White House, we have someone say it came from China, asking a Chinese journalist, why don't you go ask China? You know, those are very xenophobic things to say. Help. At the same time, we want to acknowledge with deep thankfulness the help of our fellow men, from the abolitionists down to those who today still stand for equal opportunity and who have given and still give of their wealth and of their poverty for our advancement. So all those who have given assistance back then in 1905, the Niagara movement said, thank you for all that you've done. They acknowledge what was done, duties. And while we are demanding and ought to demand and will continue to demand the rights enumerated above, that's the thing. As these African Americans during the Niagara movement in 1905 said, these are our demands. These are the things we are saying we want. These are the things we need. America, you need to follow through. But not just that we demand things, but we have duties. We have a responsibility to do particular things as American citizens. Not just say, give me, but this is what we are to do. 1905, folks, your ancestors are saying this to you. I am sharing it because I need for all of us to know and understand that we cannot deviate from these historical documents. God forbid that we should ever forget to urge corresponding duties upon our people. Number one, the duty to vote. Don't ever let anybody tell you that you should step back from voting or that you should protest vote or withhold your vote. That is the worst thing to do ever, the worst, because when you don't vote, you let the worst of the worst get more credit, and you put yourself in a worse situation than what you were already in. And you do have to pick the lesser of the evils. If there are two foods that you don't like and you have to eat one or the other, you're going to say, well, I'm not going to pick no, then it will be chosen for you. And you would have the worst of the worst. So what you need to do is minimize the damage until you have put yourself in a position to mobilize your own community and to speak up, step up, stand up, and exercise your civic duty to go to meetings, city council, board of education meetings, write to your representatives, hold them accountable, protest and ask for their removal if they're not holding up to their end of the deal. Number two, the duty to respect the rights of others. We got to have the right citizenship, folks. We cannot allow each other to be abused. When we see abuse, we have to stop it in its tracks. Number three, the duty to work. We have a duty to contribute to the well-being and the betterment of our society and our economics. And not just to work, but to do a good job, to leave a good legacy. Number four, the duty to obey laws. Yes, not every law may be right or just. That's why we write to our legislators and say, we need to fix this, we need to change this. For example, the law that makes marijuana illegal. How many African Americans have been imprisoned or lost everything for those drug offenses? And now marijuana is legalized in many states. Where's the push or the fight to expunge the records of those African American men who have suffered disproportionately for those same activities and behaviors? So we must obey the law. But if we don't find that the law is useful, then we need to rally and protest to change the laws. Some people have changed laws, but we have to learn our civic duty and learn how to be civically responsible to make those changes that we want to see. Number five, the duty to be clean and orderly. I ensure that I clean the city with my children and my community. We all have to do that. Number six, the duty to send our children to school. Our children must be educated. If we're not in favor of the type of education at the school, then we should be going to the Board of Education meeting and talking about what we would like to see in the curriculum for our children. Those are the things that we have to do. Those are our duties. 1905, folks. Number seven, the duty to respect ourselves, even as we respect others. You can't just respect the man and not respect yourself or your own people. And they made sure that there was a signature panel here. This statement, complaint, and prayer we submit to the American people and Almighty God. Sign, and there it is. Sign right here. And of course it's backwards because I am recording from home, my first COVID show from home. And I had to share that with you because if we are going to talk about voting and we're going to talk about, oh, this candidate didn't offer me this or that, you have to come to them with an agenda. Come to them with demands. I challenge you, all of you, to use all of the headings here and write your demands about protest, suffrage, civil liberty, economic opportunity, education, courts, public opinion, health, employers and labor unions, protests, color lines. Jim Crow cars would be some of the African Americans who are discriminated against even while jogging. Soldiers, war amendments, oppression, the church, agitation, help, and our duties. Let's make sure that we keep ourselves on the right track. Do not withhold your vote. Vote. And if you have to vote for the lesser of the two evils, once you get that lesser evil in, you hold them accountable. If you don't know how to hold them accountable, you look it up, you research it, you find out. You don't just bow out. You dishonor the ancestors. I want to thank everyone for tuning in to We the Village.